In South Africa, violence against women and young girls, identifying it is relatively easy, but finding a solution less so. A sexual violence conference is taking place in Cape Town this week, bringing together thousands of researchers from all over the world. Report back today from the What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls global program. It's a program funded by UK Aid, and it invests in prevention efforts in Asia and Africa. To discuss this, we're joined by the director of the What Works program, Dr. Rachel Jewkes. She's live for us from Cape Town. Doctor, thank you for being with us. Tell us about the presentation today, because you are trying to find the answer to the question on everybody's lips: what can be done to stop gender-based violence?
Well, good evening. Our program's been trying to investigate this question for 6 years, and we've been working in 15 different projects across 13 countries of Africa and Asia. And I think the key message emerging is really that prevention is possible, and that many of the types of interventions that we've been deploying in the field and evaluating have shown success in reducing women's exposure to particularly violence from their husbands or boyfriends. And when we look at the field overall, we now see that there are as many as 85 different studies that have evaluated interventions which are trying in different ways to prevent violence. And we've got success shown in many of them. We now know that there are 7 different approaches we can use to prevent violence against women and girls. Now, this doesn't mean that everything that we do using these approaches work. And I think a very, very salient message for us is that interventions don't always work. And it's not terribly easy preventing violence against women and girls. But if interventions are really well designed, they've got a strong theoretical basis, and they use strong methods, particularly participatory approaches, and they have a very well selected and trained group of staff and volunteers delivering them, then we really can see success. And this obviously requires the intervention to be delivered over a sufficiently long period of time with sufficient intensity. But if we get all of these pieces right, then violence against women and girls is preventable.
Okay, Doctor, so let's start with what works. What I saw is that there's some evidence that in informal settlements, men are using violence by 40% less. Where was that? Was that as a result of any intervention you know about? Because we still have these incredible stats in South Africa.
South Africa has got very, very high levels of violence against women and girls, particularly in some parts of the country. And informal settlements are a sort of crucible of violence, both sexual violence and intimate partner violence, that really women experience at a very, very high prevalence. But we've shown that if you have an intervention that tries to address the incredibly important and immediate needs related to poverty in those settings, that you can actually bring men to the table, and then you can begin to work with them with gender transformative interventions. And these interventions do enable men to change their behaviour, to reduce their use of violence. And I think this is an incredibly important finding, because women in these areas are so immensely vulnerable to the behaviour of the men they live with. We've also shown that these types of interventions, where you combine some form of gender empowerment intervention with an intervention that addresses economic conditions, work in many other parts, both of South Africa, where they've been applied with women, especially in rural areas. There's a famous study called the Image Study that used a gender transformative intervention applied to women who were being able to draw on microloans through a microfinance program. But these interventions have now been tested in many other settings and have been shown to have considerable effect.
What you're saying, Doctor, is encouraging, but on the other hand, in South Africa, we're not seeing economic growth. So you're making this link between people who are poor and desperate. Is that because men are emasculated? Is that because of that desperation? So it often plays out in domestic violence, which isn't great for us because the economy is not growing.
Being very poor doesn't make men feel good, just like it doesn't make women feel good. And it does feed into men's need to grasp something like their ability to dominate and control women, because they're not able to have control over other areas of their lives. But all of this doesn't mean that men are not violent if they're not desperately poor. And in fact, the patriarchal nature of our society so immensely privileges men over women and gives men ideas of sexual entitlement over women is one of the key drivers of violence. And that sense of patriarchal privilege is something that men enjoy irrespective of their position in the socio-economic spectrum.
And it's interesting that you said you brought men to the table. So are you saying you can actually change those attitudes just through dialogue with men who've maybe been brought up in certain ways?
Well, it's a little bit more than dialogue. We have to use participatory methods to get men to really reflect on who they are as men, reflect on how they behave, reflect on different influences in their lives. Because most men in South Africa are not just influenced to be violent. They actually do draw on different influences within their families and within their communities. We always have many men who are not violent. And so getting men to think about themselves as men, to think about what makes them feel good, to think about how they relate to women, how it makes them feel to be in a situation of being violent towards women is incredibly important. And we also take men back and give men an opportunity to reflect on their childhood, because across South Africa we've had a very high level of exposure to abuse and neglect of men as well as of boys as well as girls in childhood, and it impacts on children's sense of self-worth and self-esteem as they develop and grow up into adults, and it impacts on their interpersonal relationships. We obviously can't work with adults to take away what they've experienced as children, but we can work with them to help them make sense of it in different ways and to enable them to think about paths they want for themselves as adults.
Yeah. In finality, I mean, this question is often asked, can people change when they're adults? You're saying that interventions work, but can you really take a man who maybe would have hit his girlfriend, hit his wife, maybe even been guilty of rape, intervene in this way and change him?
Well, a lot of men can change. I don't want to say that everybody can change, because there's also considerable evidence that changing some of the most violent and predatory men is extremely difficult. But there are many men who use violence against women who are not men who would be necessarily identified as being particularly violent men. And those men interact in many different ways with different people in their lives. And that provides us with an opportunity to work with them and to enable them to change if we can bring them to the point where they understand and they want to change.
All right, thank you very much for that update. Encouraging, I think, because people can change, but the economy, a big issue still in South Africa. That was Dr. Rachel Jewkes, the director of the What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls Global Program. And of course, that conference on gender-based violence continues in Cape Town.